Okay, welcome to chapter 7. This lecture is going to talk about proteins. So let's get started. Okay, we will start with learning objectives 1 and 2. So the first learning objective is to identify the structural components of proteins and distinguish between essential and non-essential amino acids. Proteins are large, complex molecules. They consist of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And unlike carbohydrates and lipids, that is the main first distinction. They are also made up of building blocks called amino acids that are joined together by peptide bonds. So, again, when you look at proteins, they are macromolecules, and their subunits are called amino acids. Those amino acids are joined together by what we call peptide bonds. Proteins are going to be able to perform a variety of functions in the body, from building and repairing tissue to serving as enzymes or hormones. And so, understanding how their structure works is going to be key to understanding how their function works. So, let's look at their structure. So, all amino acids are, again, the building blocks of proteins, and they essentially have the same basic structure. So if you look in the green boxes there, you can see that they have a central carbon atom. That carbon atom is bound to a hydrogen and then two blue groups. The one on the left is called the amino group, and the amino group is an NH2 group. And then on the other side, they've got the carboxyl group or the carboxylic acid. And this is where you get the name amino acid. Now, the only thing that makes each of the 20 amino acids distinct from one another is that R group or that side chain group. Between all of the 20 amino acids, that is what makes them unique. Everything else is the same. So the side chain is what determines the properties and the functions of the individual amino acids. When you look at amino acids a little bit deeper, we told you that there are 20 different amino acids, and 9 of them we call essential. These essential amino acids are essential because we cannot create them. They must be obtained from our diet. The remaining 11 are non essential, meaning that our bodies are able to synthesize them on their own. Now, there's something called transamination and deamination, and these are processes involved in metabolizing amino acids. The carbon skeleton that might remain after deamination can be used for energy or used to make other compounds like glucose. So, amino acids are very important, and the body uses them for a number of different functions. So, now let's differentiate between high quality proteins and low quality proteins, otherwise known as complete and incomplete proteins. So, if a food is described as a complete protein, it means that it has all 9 of the required essential amino acids. Now, most plant proteins are incomplete, with some small exceptions like quinoa or buckwheat and soy. And those all contain all of the essential amino acids. But don't fear, because if you are not a meat eater, we will talk about how you can get around this. You can do things like mutual supplementation, which means that you combine 2 or more incomplete proteins and get all of the proteins and therefore have a healthy diet. So let's take a look at why the body needs amino acids. Now, the reason the body needs proteins is to get the amino acids to join in what we call the amino acid pool. The amino acid pool consists of all the amino acids available for protein synthesis. And you get those amino acids, of course, from your dietary proteins and then the breakdown of other proteins in the body. Protein synthesis can be limited by the availability of those essential amino acids. So if you're not getting them through your diet, your body is in big trouble. Now, again, let's come back to this sort of worry or maybe even a myth that you've got to consume meat or dairy in order to get complete protein. uh, that's not true. So again, I told you about the fact that you can do mutual supplementation if you are, a plant eater, you're a vegetarian or vegan. If you're worried on missing out on those amino acids, do mutual supplementation, which is combining two or more of those incomplete protein sources to make a complete protein. For example, beans and rice, staple dinner in lots of cultures, and this is two incomplete proteins on their own, but together make it complete. It's also not necessary to eat those complementary proteins in the same meal, but it is important to do it on the same day. Some other examples of mutual supplementation: hummus and whole wheat pita bread, a lentil soup and cornbread, peanut butter sandwich. All of those things would be complete proteins for those who do not wish to have animal proteins. And if you look in your textbook, table 7-2 on page 246, I'll give you a whole bunch of other examples if that's something you're interested in. Okay, moving on to learning objective 4, let's talk about protein synthesis. Now, the time that I have in the video is not really adequate to go through this process in the complete level of detail, so you'll really want to focus on this in your textbook and in your homework. But if you want to review figure 7.5 from your book, it'll give you most of the information that you need. And so then at the end of this, you would ask yourself, do I have enough information that I can explain the story of protein synthesis in the correct order? So what is this correct order? So first, let's talk about what protein synthesis is. Protein synthesis involves, two main processes. The first is called transcription, and the second is called translation. So first, during transcription, the DNA is housed in the cell's nucleus. That DNA is used as a template to create what are called messenger RNAs or mRNA. And the enzyme RNA polymerase can unzip the DNA and assemble that mRNA by matching RNA nucleotides with those DNA bases. So for example, you might have heard about A, T, G, and C. Well, these are complementary pairs where A binds with T and G binds with C. Well, when RNA polymerase reads an A, instead of a T, it'll put a U. But when it sees a T, it puts an A. And G and C remains the same. So it's the same code. It's kind of like the same language during transcription. And so I always tell students, if you think about transcription like this, if I asked you to transcribe page 30 out of the textbook, and that textbook was in English, well, you would just be simply writing that down in the same language, English to English. Well, in transcription, we're going from the language of nucleotides in DNA to the language of nucleotides in RNA. So once the RNA polymerase is finished and all of those RNA nucleotides have been assembled into the messenger RNA, it will then leave the nucleus and enter the cytoplasm. Next, in translation, the mRNA moves over and attaches to a organelle called a ribosome. The ribosome you can think of as a cell's protein factory. And then we have something called a tRNA or a transfer RNA molecule. Those molecules are attached to amino acids, and they bring those amino acids to the ribosome. Each tRNA has a 3-letter anticodon that pairs with a specific 3-letter codon on the mRNA. As the ribosome moves along the mRNA, tRNAs will bring the correct amino acids in sequence. And these amino acids are joined together by peptide bonds to form what we call a polypeptide chain. The chain will then fold into a fully functional protein. So to summarize, DNA is transcribed into mRNA in the nucleus, and then mRNA is translated into a protein in the ribosome with some help of tRNA and its amino acids. So let's review next the 4 different levels of protein structure. What distinguishes each level and why the 3-dimensional shape of a protein is so important. But first, let's start with the primary structure. The primary structure is the unique sequence of amino acids in a polypeptide chain. And of course, that sequence is determined by your genetic code, the DNA. But this determines and dictates the protein's properties and functions. So for example, up on the screen, you see alanine, glycine, serine, valine, leucine, lysine, glycine, valine. I like to think of these as letters in a word or like somebody's name. So if my name is B-O-B Bob and your name is T-O-M Tom, those are all part of the alphabet of 26 letters, but they are formed in different sequences. And so they're different words. And so if you think of the amino acids, alanine, glycine, serine, as letters in a 20-letter alphabet, if we change out even one of those amino acids, we've essentially changed the entire sequence and thus we've changed the protein. Next is the secondary structure. And the secondary structure refers to localized folding of the polypeptide chain into structures. The two main structures that we want to focus on are called alpha helices, like you might see on the screen there, or something called a beta pleated sheet. Now, these shapes are stabilized by hydrogen bonds between the backbone of the atoms of the polypeptide chain. Now, you get this over and over again as we move along the primary structure, and eventually you reach the tertiary structure, which is an overall three-dimensional shape of a single polypeptide chain. That structure is formed by interactions between the side chain or R groups of all of the amino acids, including hydrogen bonds, ionic bonds, hydrophobic interactions, and something called a disulfide bridge. That tertiary structure could be its own functional protein, but generally we move up to quaternary structure, which occurs when two or more polypeptide chains in their tertiary structures come together to form the overall functional protein. Now, the function of the protein is directly related to the shape of the protein. A lot of times you'll hear form equals function. The shape allows the protein to interact with other molecules, enables it to perform its biological role, and any alteration in the protein shape, like something we'll talk about called denaturation, would also lead to a loss of function and potentially cause diseases. So what happens if a protein does lose its shape, and why does that happen? So proteins can lose their shape or denature due to generally changes in pH or temperature. And again, why is this significant? Because as you see on the right, if you lose the shape, you are losing the function, and that can have some significant implications for overall health. Okay, moving on to learning objective 5 in chapter 7. Where can we find proteins? Well, easily understandable. You can find it in animal proteins, but you can also find it in tofu and legumes and almonds and egg and peanut butter, cheddar cheese, lots of different places to find proteins. But aside from animal products, again, lots of our legumes and nuts, and again, quinoa, which is great. It's also a complete protein. Okay, moving on to learning objective 6. Let's talk about nitrogen balance. What do I mean by nitrogen balance? Well, nitrogen balance is a method where we can determine protein needs for an individual. So if protein intake is equal to protein loss, then we say that we've achieved nitrogen balance. But if we don't, and we've got a negative nitrogen balance, that would indicate that we've got an insufficient protein intake with a positive protein, an insufficient protein intake with our losses. Now, a positive nitrogen balance would occur if we've got more intake than loss, and generally that occurs during growth or recovery. In reality, though, nitrogen balance is pretty difficult to conduct in a real world. Generally, it's only able to be done outside, in the outside world of hospitals or research facilities. And so it's really more realistic to calculate protein needs based on the RDA. Now, again, if you've got a negative nitrogen balance, that means you've got an inadequate protein take, and that might also be combined with a serious untreated illness or injury. And so those diseases are increasing your protein breakdown. And over time, that is going to result in the wasting of lean body mass. The body will start to break down its own proteins. And so you might lose protein from your skeletal muscles or your blood or your heart or your liver, and those are not good things. Now, what might we see positive nitrogen balances? It's again during periods of growth and recovery from an injury or trauma or illness, in order to get sufficient materials for building and repairing those tissues. So what is the RDA for protein? So for most adults, the RDA for protein is 0.8 grams per kilogram of healthy body weight. But remember that your AMDR for protein is only 10 to 35% of your daily energy. And most Americans are typically able to access and will typically consume well more than the RDA, even though we are unable to store it. And finally, the RDA for protein doesn't really include the additional protein needs if you are recovering from an illness or injury, or if you are a highly trained athlete. In those situations, the RDA for a protein could range up to 2 grams per kilogram of body weight. So it's important to understand how individual differences will change needs. Okay, so let's practice calculating the RDA for protein. So Simu is a sedentary adult that is 6 foot tall and 160 pounds. The question says, how much protein would you recommend that they consume? So if we're going to do that, we're going to have to multiply the body weight in kilograms by 8 grams. So in order to get to kilograms from pounds, you divide by 2.2. So 160 pounds is really 72.7 kilograms. And then all you have to do is multiply that by 0.8 grams per kilogram, and you find it's 58.2 grams of protein for this person. Now, there is a difference again between RDA and AMDR, and remember that it would also depend on, body weight of the individual, but that is very specific for this person. Okay, let's move on and talk about some enzyme substrates and products of protein digestion and where they occur. So, can you tell the story of protein digestion and absorption? Well, first of all, it begins with this in the stomach with hydrochloric acid and pepsin, and then moves into the small intestine where we get the final digestion occurring. And then the liver, amino acids get absorbed into the portal vein and transported to the liver, and there they will enter the general bloodstream. Now, once you've reached the large intestine, you will likely not have much dietary protein left at all if things are going well. Okay. Again, the amino acid pool is important to help the body perform lots of its functions. And so, really, the takeaway here is that if you're not intaking enough protein, lots of things can go wrong. Okay, what kinds of things do the proteins do in the body? Well, they play numerous roles: growth, repair, production of enzymes, hormone regulation, fluid balance, acid base balance, immune system function. And they also can serve as an energy source when necessary. Now, that's important. It's really not the body's first choice. The body's first choice would be glucose. And it requires a process called deamination. And we also don't store a lot of it. So you have to be eating a whole bunch of that if you want it to be your primary source of energy. Now, what can happen? What are some health concerns related to protein intake? Well, remember that if protein is not adequate, you can develop lots of diseases, and we'll just talk about two that are pretty common. Kwashiorkor is something that can result from from a sufficient calorie intake. You're getting energy, but you're not getting enough protein. Generally, the cause of this is early weaning of a infant due to a short arrival of another baby, and you get replacement of breast milk with a low protein cereal. And complications of kwashiorkor generally develop very quickly, and what you'll see is a swollen abdomen. Otherwise, the body will look quite gaunt apart from that abdomen. And the reason for that is that the low protein content in the blood is inadequate to prevent edema. Now, treatment for this would be to improve both protein and overall energy intake to get the individual back to a healthy body weight. Another potential problem is marasmus. And this one is caused by basically a combination of an inability of inadequate intake of protein, energy, and other nutrients. And So it would be very important to get this person healthy by first correcting their fluid and electrolyte imbalances, then adding proteins and carbs and adding fats much later. But this one, if not treated, could obviously result in death. Okay. Now, finally, PKU, phenylketonuria, is an inherited genetic disorder. And this one is going to cause an inability for the body to break down phenylalanine, which is an amino acid. Now, this can lead to horrendous brain damage. And that, don't worry, because most babies are tested for this right at birth just because of how dangerous it is. And if you are found to have PKU, the only treatment is to restrict your diet of any phenylalanine at all so that you do not build up and cause brain damage. All right, let's move on to learning objective 11 and talk about, are there any problems with too much dietary protein? Well, it's hard to say. It's likely not really, because most Americans are going to well exceed the RDA for protein with really not even trying to. I mean, we get access to lots of protein if you are, you know, uh, lucky enough to live in areas without access to food in this country. And you're not even really trying to get a lot of protein. You just probably getting much more than you need. Now, it's important to really make a note here that consuming excessive or a disproportionate amount of protein doesn't really provide any health benefits. Remember, you cannot store this. So there really is only so much that you can use, even if you are weightlifting, for example. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that a lot of times high protein diets, if they're an animal source, are also going to be higher in saturated fats. And if you have low fiber intake added on to that and you don't eat a lot of plants to get some beneficial phytochemicals, you might be putting yourself at risk for cardiovascular disease. There's also no conclusive evidence that high protein diets lead to bone loss. This was something that was brought up when a diet called the Atkins diet was introduced, where we could cut out carbohydrates and switch to high protein diet. That was a concern, but it doesn't seem like there's any evidence for that as long as you're getting calcium. Now, there is some potential for a high protein diet to increase the risk of kidney disease, but really the evidence only shows that if you have impaired kidney function already. And so the experts kind of agree that you could eat a whole bunch of protein, up to 2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight each day, and you'd be fine as long as you're a healthy, active individual. Okay, let's just look at vegetarian diets. Again, why would somebody want to do this? Well, it could be health reasons, it could be religious or philosophical, it could be ecological, you care about the earth, and it could be economical. So we have vegans who only consume plant foods, or lacto-vegetarians who will introduce some dairy products into plant food diets, or lacto-ovo-vegetarians who will also add eggs into that mix. Now, just because you are eating a plant-based diet for the most part, doesn't mean that you can't get your protein, but there are also other nutrients of concern in a vegan diet. These are vitamin B12, vitamin D, vitamin B2, riboflavin, iron, calcium, and zinc. And so you'll just want to make sure that you're also supplementing your vegan diet if you are partaking in one. So thanks for watching, and that's the video.